My name is Kobe Rizek, and I'm the current president of the Buckley program. I'd like to welcome all of you to this firing line debate on immigration between David Azerrad and Alex Nowrasteh. Before I introduce our guest this afternoon, I want to say a few words about the Buckley program. First, for those of you who don't know, the William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting free speech and intellectual diversity on Yale's campus. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates like this one, as well as an annual conference. Yale's over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all believe that the only way to reach the best solution to a problem is to hear all perspectives. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows maintain that all viewpoints must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. The deadline to become a fellow this semester is March 23rd. All Yale undergraduate and graduate students are eligible for fellowship. Next, a reminder that the Buckley program summer internship program deadlines are quickly approaching. The program generously offers $4,000 of funding for summer internships. March 1st is the deadline for the internships at both National Review and the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. All Yale students, not just Buckley Fellows, are eligible to apply to these internships and can do so on Yale's career website, Simplicity. In addition, the Buckley program's Instagram will, I think for the first time ever, run a poll following this event for audience members to vote on which of our two guests they think won the debate today. So, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Make sure to follow our Instagram if you haven't done so at Buckley Program in order to vote in the poll. Now I'll move to today's guests. Dr. David Azerrad is an assistant professor and research fellow at Hillsdale College's Van Andel Graduate School of Government in Washington, D.C. His research and writing focuses on classical liberalism, conservative political thought, and identity politics. Prior to joining Hillsdale, Azerrad was the director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics at the Heritage Foundation. He has taught previously at American University and at the University of Dallas. A native of Montreal, Azerrad received his BA from Concordia University, his MA from Carleton University, and his PhD in politics from the University of Dallas. Alex Nowrasteh is the Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. His popular publications have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, The Washington Post, and most other major publications in the United States. Alex regularly appears on Fox News, MSNBC, Bloomberg, NPR, and numerous television and radio stations across the country. He is a co-author of the booklet Open Immigration, Yay and Nay. Mr. Nowrasteh is a native of Southern California and received his BA in Economics from George Mason University and a Master of Science in Economic History from the London School of Economics. We look forward to hearing from Dr. Azerrad and Mr. Nowrasteh this afternoon. By a random coin toss, it has been decided that Mr. Nowrasteh will begin with his opening statements, followed by Dr. Azerrad. Following opening statements, which will last around 10 minutes each of them will have a chance to respond to each other's statements for 2 minutes. After this, we will have a period of back and forth between the two guests, peppered with some guiding questions from me and the audience. And for the last 5 or so minutes, each guest will have a few minutes to present a brief closing statement. So with no further ado, Mr. Nowrasteh, please begin your opening statement. And please join me in welcoming our guests to this debate this afternoon.
Thanks very much for inviting me here today and for attending this debate. When Ellis Island was opened and in operation from 1892 through 1921, when the U.S. had open borders with most of the world, it was nicknamed the Isle of Tears because 2% of immigrants were turned back by border officials. Now that system was replaced with this bureaucratic monstrosity. You all might have pieces of paper on there right there that show this, that exists to this day within modified form. Now under this current system, almost 90% of people can't even apply in the first place to legally come here at all. Now the result of this centrally planned chaos, illegal immigration, and tens of millions of people locked into perpetual poverty at tremendous loss to the United States. Millions of Americans who want to contract and interact with foreigners are not allowed to because of these immigration laws. The system of immigration restrictions that are in place right now in the United States, I believe, are inconsistent with American and Western principles. Now, surprisingly, the Ellis Island system of immigration was actually quite restrictive compared to what preceded it. From 1875 to 1882, for instance, only criminals, prostitutes, and the insane were not allowed into the United States. Prior to 1875, the U.S. had literal open borders with zero federal restrictions on immigration. Now, I'll say that again because it's so shocking to most people, but there were zero federal immigration restrictions prior to 1875. Sometimes states quarantined sick people or sent them to other states, but that's about it. Now, it's that earlier system, however, with some restrictions related to public safety and the like, that I believe is more consistent with American and Western principles of individual liberty, representative governments, and free markets, much more so than the Soviet-style system of immigration control that exists today. Now, when the American founders declared their independence from the United Kingdom, they listed their grievances in a document called the Declaration of Independence. One of the complaints against King George III was that he, quote, endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. The colonists' complaints about immigration restrictions were so important in justifying their rebellion that when they wrote the Constitution about 11 years after they signed the Declaration, they didn't even list control of immigration as an enumerated power held by Congress in Article 1, Section 8. You can search in vain for it. It does not exist. It was invented later by courts. The Constitution enumerated every other power that we assume should be held by a legitimate government, like having a military, levying taxes, government relations with other foreign governments, and even to establish a post office. But control over immigration was left out of the original document intentionally. This was not a thoughtless omission. The American founders weren't the first people in Western civilization to support the free movement of peaceful people across borders. From democratic Athens to Rome to exhortations in the Old Testament, Christianity, Magna Carta, points 41 and 42, natural rights ideology, legal doctrines of Francisco de Vitoria, Hugo Grotius, and modern utilitarianism, egalitarianism, and other ideologies, there is ample evidence that one of Western civilization's intellectual gifts to the world was support for the free movement of peaceful people who are no threat to public safety or the existence and security of the state. Now, maybe all of those foundational Western texts and luminaries of our civilization were incorrect, but I don't think they were. Now that brings me to, I think, what is the immigration subtopic of this debate, which is merit-based immigration. Now, in general, merit-based immigration is just a code phrase for cutting legal immigration, including cutting out the most highly skilled and ambitious legal immigrants. Every bill introduced in Congress to create a merit-based immigration system since President Trump endorsed this idea, all of which have been endorsed by the president, of course, cut legal immigration by 40 to 60%. Those cuts, of course, also slashed legal, high-skilled immigrants to the country. Now, how do I know this? I actually read all those stupid bills in their entirety and all the words and referenced it back to the U.S. Code. That's part of my job. Those who support merit-based immigration, I think, should stop hiding behind the rhetoric and actually tell us why the U.S. government should cut in half the number of legal immigrants allowed to the United States, including cutting the number of skilled legal immigrants. Now, the Canadian immigration system is a supposed model for a merit-based immigration system, according at least to politicians who tell us that they want it. But it lets in almost 3 times as many legal immigrants annually as a percentage of Canada's population, an important point, as a percentage of Canada's population as the U.S. does. Unsurprisingly, the percentage of the population in Canada that's foreign-born is about 20% compared to just shy of 14% in the United States. Not a single merit-based immigration bill introduced by a Republican or endorsed by President Trump would increase the immigration of skilled workers to anything like the numbers that exist in Canada. Now, it bears repeating, but every merit-based immigration bill actually introduced will cut legal immigration and cut the number of skilled immigrants. If the U.S. government must have a merit-based immigration system, whatever that actually means, and if we have to limit the number of immigrants because we suddenly trust central planners to pick those numbers, then the government should just auction green cards to the highest bidders. Let the market decide. There's no need for politicians to pretend that they know what's best for the U.S. by deciding the exact number of computer programmers or Nobel laureates that should be allowed in. Just sell visas to whomever will pay the most, taking account, of course, of security factors. At a minimum, The benefit of this is that we could listen to populist politicians a little bit less, which would be a huge public benefit in and of itself. Now, I freely admit that auctioning green cards is not as fun for central planners who want to tinker with American demographics, but it'll work better for our country, its current citizens, and its future citizens than in any of the immigration cuts that have been proposed under the rhetoric of merit-based immigration. Ultimately, the current restrictive immigration system should be done away with, and we should return to something like that which existed prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Healthy, non-criminals who aren't security threats should be able to live and work here and eventually become citizens if they want to. That is a system under which most of our ancestors came here. It is a system that helped build the United States. American citizens should have the freedom to contract with, engage with, and deal with any peaceful people around the world on a voluntary, mutually beneficial basis with a minimum of government control and administrative state interference. The type of system I propose is consistent with American and Western traditions. It is a free market immigration system with as little government intervention as possible, and it is one that preserves freedom of association for American citizens. Now, the economic justification for a deregulation of immigration is strong. The economic benefits for immigrants and native-born Americans is extraordinary, and the peer-reviewed academic evidence on this is vast. The U.S. economy is not zero-sum, and immigrants add far more than they consume. I recommend thinking about it this way. Any argument that you hear against immigration from an economic perspective, just substitute in the word people or babies for immigrants and see if it makes any sense to you. If it doesn't make any sense, you know it's a nonsense argument and you should reject it. There is no economic model or system that says fewer people is good for the economy, and I don't think we're about to discover one either. Restrictionists also say that they're worried about cultural assimilation. By all measurements that we have going back over a century, immigrants and their children assimilate fully into U.S. culture along the lines of language, religiosity, family size, civic participation, income, education, and even the choice of names for their children. It takes about 20 years for that one to happen. The pace of assimilation is essentially unchanged from what it was 100 years ago, according to Jacob Vigdor, an economist from the University of Washington who studies this. As Jake wrote, quote, "Basic indicators of assimilation, from naturalization to English ability, are, if anything, stronger now than they were a century ago. Maybe, just maybe, those who think that immigrants assimilated well in the past, but not today, have no idea how people in the past actually behaved, nor do they understand how well it's going today." Ultimately, freer immigration, at the very least, is consistent with American and Western principles and is a prime example of American exceptionalism. Furthermore, it is the free market policy choice that allows workers and entrepreneurs to move to where they are most highly valued. Not only are immigrants and their descendants assimilating into American culture, but our culture and its norms are spreading over the world and influencing people before they even arrive here. The anti-immigration argument rests on a misunderstanding of the social science, a view of institutions different from that of our founders, and rhetoric like the phrase merit-based immigration that obscures their actual policy preferences. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Alex, for participating, and thank you to the Buckley Society for hosting this debate. Alex and I did a similar debate at the Philadelphia Society's annual meeting a few months ago, and it was both feisty and intellectually stimulating, and I hope that sparks are going to fly again today. The question before us is, what kind of an immigration system should we adopt as a country? And as with every other issue, both domestic and foreign, the answer is always very simple. America should pursue a policy that advances the common good and serves the national interest. It's that simple. When it comes to immigration, Trump didn't get it right. It shouldn't be America first. It should be America first, second, and third. Nix that. It should be Americans first. Their interest and well-being should be the overriding priority. Now, you may well say, Azerrad, I schlepped over here in the cold to hear you state a basic political tautology. Of course, American policy should serve America, in the same way that Swedish policy should serve Swedes, Tanzanian policy Tanzanians, Mongolians, Mongolia, or Mongolia, Mongolians. Everything hinges on how you define the term, what is best for them. And as you know, there's no consensus on what the common good is or what the national interest is. That's why we have politics, because we disagree about these things. Well, some of us do. But some of us, like my friends at the Cato Institute, disagree with the premise altogether. You see, Alex, the good libertarian economist that he is, does not believe in a national interest or a common political good because at the end of the day, he doesn't really believe in countries. He believes, and here I quote him, that, quote, "We're an economy with a country, not a country with an economy," end quote. August 23rd, 2018 on Twitter. This is the crux of the disagreement. You see, we're not having a debate about immigration this evening. This is a second-order disagreement. Our fundamental and irreconcilable differences pertain to whether we should have sovereign countries with borders or just global open markets. You see, from the point of view of free markets, borders make no sense. They artificially impede the free flow of goods and peoples. They're inefficient. They insulate national markets from foreign competition. They therefore drive up the prices of goods and services. And we should have open borders. This is the foundational argument of free market fundamentalism, and all libertarians are free market fundamentalists. But the premise is wrong. America is not an economy. It's a country. It's called the United States of America, not the United Markets of America. We do not live in a market, we go to a market. And we are citizens of a republic, not Nietzsche's last man wholly consumed in our pathetic private pleasures. America does not exist to maximize GDP. America exists, and here I quote the most beautiful line of the Constitution from the preamble, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That, you could say, is the mission statement for America. America exists to serve Americans and their posterity, not humanity. And we want the blessings of liberty, not just the mindless exercise of liberty. By the way, if you think that massive third world immigration is a blessing, I would encourage you to go spend a summer in France and travel around and then compare what you see with your own eyes with the studies that Alex is citing. Economic prosperity, of course, someone may say, is a great blessing of liberty, and this I would not deny, but it is not a trump card. A policy may make no sense whatsoever from an economic point of view, forbidding the sale of enriched uranium to the Iranians, criminalizing hard drugs, banning child pornography, subsidizing marriage and childbearing. But such a policy may still be politically necessary or salutary. Economics must be subordinated to statesmanship, to first-order political considerations about preserving the regime. This is something that libertarians cannot understand because libertarianism is not a political theory. It is an economic theory masquerading as a political theory. And I must thank Alex for putting an end to the masquerade and owning up the fact that he thinks that America is first and foremost an economy and not a country. I would also like to remind you that you shouldn't put too much stock in these studies, forecasts, and grand pronouncements of economists. Economics is not a science. I know that they've somehow managed to convince the Swedes to give them a Nobel Prize, but that doesn't make the dismal science a real science. They didn't predict the 2008 crash. They don't even know what caused the 2008 crash. They didn't even, to this day, they can't agree on what caused the 1929 crash. They don't agree on what happens if you increase the minimum wage. Across the board, there are major disagreements in the field of macroeconomics. There are, by contrast, no ideological schisms in the hard sciences. There are no saltwater and clear water physicists or chemists, for example. Now, that is not to say that all economists are fools and that they have nothing to teach us. I, for one, have learned much from reading Hayek. But economists should never have the final say in political deliberations because they lack a framework to process the two most basic political categories, countries and citizens. There are no citizens in economics, just consumers. And there are no countries either, just markets. I emphasize this as a prelude to my argument to establish that we are not required to bow down before the gods of markets and open up our borders. Like all sovereign nations, we are free to pursue whatever immigration policy we think best serves us. And with apologies to Milton Open Borders Friedman, we are free to choose. So when it comes to immigration, we basically confront the three same questions that every other country confronts. On what basis do we admit immigrants? How many do we let in? And what do we expect of them once they arrive? And the third question is the most important one because it sets limits to the first two. You see, you can only take in as many immigrants as you can assimilate. Immigration and assimilation are two sides of the same coin. Successful assimilation is the only possible way to justify immigration from a political point of view. Otherwise, you're intentionally sowing seeds of discord in your country by making citizens more unlike one another, and you are weakening the strong civic ties that should bind us together. Contrary to what your woke overlords have taught you, diversity is not a strength when it comes to politics. Unity is. That's why we want immigrants to forswear all foreign allegiances, to learn English, to adopt our way of life, to profess devotion to our Republican principles, to marry our sons and daughters, and eventually to disappear into the population at large. Here is how George Washington put it, the father of our country. By an intermixture with our people, they or their descendants get assimilated to our customs, measures, and laws. In a word, they soon become one people.
This is a 2-minute warning.
Thank you. There was a time when this wasn't much of an issue because all of us believed in patriotic assimilation and expected immigrants to become Americans. But we no longer have the self-confidence we once did. We are no longer sure that our way of life is better. In fact, our elites are convinced that it is not. They teach us that America is steeped in racism, sexism, homophobia, and soulless consumerism. Our schools and our universities no longer teach children to love their countries. In fact, they teach them to despise it. Howard Zinn, not Paul Johnson, is our national historian. To make matters worse, we promote the very opposite of assimilation. Because of the cancerous spread of identity politics in America, immigrants are encouraged to think of themselves as oppressed minorities. All of us are hyphenated Americans, and what counts is what comes before the hyphen. The point is, the obstacles to patriotic assimilation are greater today than they have ever been. And to be clear, the fault lies primarily with us, not the immigrants. But this should give us pause. Do you know what else should give us pause? Is the unprecedented levels of immigration to America in the past 50 years. Since we enacted the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, 60 million people or so have immigrated to America. This is the largest recorded migration in human history. As a result, today, 14% of Americans are foreign-born. That's the largest share of the population in over a century. 1 in every 4 Americans is an immigrant or child of immigrants. And that number is set to grow because this wave of immigration, unlike previous ones, never stopped. So if you look at the last big wave of immigration we had, from about Reconstruction to 1924, it then stopped, and we had a 40-year period where we could digest the wave of immigration and ensure that the Irish, the Italians, and the Eastern Europeans became Americans. It also helped at the time, by the way, that there was no internet, no affordable long-distance telephone calls, and no cheap air travel. When you left for good. Today, by contrast, immigrants can remain connected to their homeland thanks to the wonders of technology. And so, with each passing year, the very idea of a unified we the people grows weaker. This is not meant to suggest, and I will end, that we should accept no immigrants whatsoever. My point is simply to impress upon you the concrete circumstances we live in today that make it considerably more difficult to assimilate immigrants than in the past. Therefore, I would suggest that for the foreseeable future, we do two things. One is we take in considerably fewer immigrants than we now do, and we admit them not on the basis of merit, but extraordinary merit. It's not enough to speak English, have a trade, have gone to college, and be law-abiding. We should set a very high bar to allow only the most gifted people in all realms of human accomplishment to immigrate to America if they want to. And then second, we should admit a small number of refugees in keeping with our traditions. I, however, would give priorities to refugees fleeing China since China is our #1 strategic competitor, and giving a home to political dissidents would be a coup, I think, for America.
All right, and Mr. Nowrasteh, you will now have 2 minutes to respond to Dr. Azerrad.
National sovereignty has nothing to do with the immigration debate here today. I grant to David, for the purposes of this debate, that the United States should choose an immigration policy that is best for the United States. Therefore, I would not change a single word of what I said in my opening statement, and it doesn't affect any of the facts of the policies that are out there today or that should be adopted. From 1790 to 1875, the U.S. had literal open borders, a policy more open than I think is appropriate, because I think there should be some restrictions and security concerns. Were we not a country from 1790 to 1875? Did the U.S. government not exist? Was it not sovereign? Were there not elections to members of Congress? Did we not fight a brutal civil war and numerous other wars against other people? If you answer, yeah, the U.S. wasn't a country then I don't know what the point of this debate is. But there is no contention, there is no any kind of stress between the idea of national sovereignty and an immigration policy that is more open, that is open to people from around the world. Now, I did say that the America is an economy with a country, not a country with an economy. The context of that debate was with somebody over Twitter over the term nation state. Nation state comes from the Latin term natio, which means birth or ethnic group. The United States is not founded as a nation state. It cannot be a nation state because we do not all come from the same ethnic group. That's one of the great things about America, is that it is a melting pot. So the context of that was like, yes, we are not a European-style nation state. I do not propose that we become a European-style nation state. That would exclude the vast majority of us from any kind of membership in that organization. As for immigration today being at unprecedented levels, that is simply untrue. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, annual immigrant flows to the United States were, as a percentage of the population at the time, 4 to 5 times higher than they are today. It would be as if the United States today would be letting in 4 to 5 million people a year rather than the 1 million people who are coming in. Now, we talk a lot about patriotic assimilation and the stuff that they teach kids in school. My kids are going to be going to school in a few years, and the worst part about public schools is the nonsense they teach our kids. But the good part about public schools is that kids don't learn anything. And we see that reflected in a lot of the surveys. People don't pay attention to these things. These worries about non-patriotism being taught is a worry amongst elites and universities who have no real-world experience with these systems. If you won't believe that, take a look at the General Social Survey. All immigrants, this is a question from the General Social Survey, the largest biennial survey in the United States. Is America better than other countries? All immigrants agree, 71%. Natives, only 72%.
Mr. Nowrasteh, I'm going to have to move on to Dr. Azerrad, but you'll both have a chance to respond to each other.
A lot of numbers, they all say the same thing. Immigrants are a little bit more proud of America than native-born Americans.
Alex is shifting between two positions that sound the same but should be distinguished. One is he's arguing, this is his fundamental argument, is that America must have open borders at all times because our principles, the whole of Western tradition, our Constitution, and our past demand it. This is nonsense on stilts. The founders would have laughed in your face if you had told them that they had set up a sovereign nation that was not permitted to police its borders. At the time, they favored an open immigration policy because we had a vast empty continent to conquer and settle. Things change. Nothing requires America to have open borders. The argument that it's not on the Constitution is also mistaken. Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress the powers to define and punish laws against the offenses against the laws of nation, which anyone who's read their Blackwell or Vattel would know, covers immigration. So he wants you to believe that we must have, and that if we don't, it's a betrayal of America. That's nonsense. The second argument he'll then shift to is say, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's the best course for America, but you supposedly would be permitted to pick another one. That is also mistaken. Given the scale of immigration we've had, given our inability to process and digest the wave of immigration, given the state of the country, the prudent thing to do right now is to scale it back considerably. So either of the positions he's mistaken, one is flat out wrong, the other is imprudent.
Right. So we're going to have a few questions from myself and then move on to questions from the audience. My first is for Dr. Azerrad. How should we attempt to measure then the general well-being of a nation, if not at all using economic metrics?
I mean, Look, I made fun of economics. Let me not have you believe for 1 second that I don't think that political science is a complete joke of a discipline also. I mean, certain things are not, and that's what I got my PhD in. I mean, we want to measure everything. In my defense, I studied political philosophy, but we are housed in political science departments. There are certain things you just can't measure precisely. I mean, you can get a sense of things, but, you know, I would look at the percentage of the population that is foreign-born. I would look at, you know, you can't properly measure assimilation. It's just not true. I mean, I would go to Europe and see with my own eyes. I would go to California. There are many bad things that have happened in California. One is, you know, it's become America's first sanctuary state. And I would trust common sense and what I see with my own eyes rather than studies. I hope you don't view this as a cop-out and refusing to answer your question, but I refuse to grant the premise that only things that we can measure with mathematical precision are true. Human beings are not atoms. The social sciences are completely defective when compared to the natural sciences because the natural sciences deal with matter and motion. The social sciences deal with human beings.
Mr. Nowrasteh, do you have a response to Dr. Azerrad's answer to my question?
For one thing, science is about methods. It's not about whether you measure atoms, but it's about methods. Just read your economics textbook and you can figure that out. We have models and we test those models. There are lots of natural sciences that also use probabilities and statistics to come to these conclusions, and they test models. Lots of theoretical physics is based on that, so that's just incorrect. Secondly, Oregon was the country's first sanctuary state in 1987. Can't blame the immigrants for that one necessarily. And I would say that, notice the waffling. Oh, you can't measure this thing that I think is going badly, but I think it is because I saw something that I don't like. While in a country of 330 million people, I see a lot of things that I don't like, including a lot of nasty politicians who make things up and pretend that they have the economics on their side when they don't. And frankly, I trust people who use scientific methods to measure real data that exists over people judging policy based on their feelings.
All right, and Mr. Nowrasteh, brief question for you. It doesn't seem that you've yet sort of faced Dr. Azerrad's claims about sort of unquantifiable factors such as assimilation or national cultural identity head on. How do you respond to the claim that we can't just accept unlimited immigrants, even if for the sole reason that like cultural assimilation exists and can only happen at a set sort of linear rate in every set amount of time?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One, the rate of assimilation for immigrants in the 19th century prior to the closing of the border in 1921 and 1924 was unchanged prior to the closing of those borders than it was afterwards. There was no change in the rate of immigrant assimilation or their children's assimilation in the United States. Everything that we can measure from religiosity, family size, education, income, whether you think America is the best country in the world is a question they actually ask and have been asking for a long time, unchanged. Immigrants are very positive about this country and are doing incredibly well. If you want to go back to the period of time from 1920s to the late 1960s when we had an immigration policy a little closer to what David thinks is appropriate, does anybody think like the early 60s and 50s were a time of great national cohesion? When there were all these nasty laws on the books, especially in the American South, but also riots rocking American cities in the North. Race relations were at their worst, of course, right then. Anybody want to look back to the 1960s and say, yep, that's the cultural cohesion and solidarity that I want? Where's the evidence for this? I don't see any evidence. I see a lot of grand claims. I see a lot of pronouncements and statements based, frankly, in a misunderstanding of American history.
Well, that's possible. I'm Canadian, so maybe I don't know my mayor.
Dr. Azerrad, you have a few minutes to respond.
I'm happy you're here, by the way. Even though we disagree, I think you have the right to be here.
You have a few minutes to respond to his answer if you wish.
I mean, I'm not sure what I mean, I'm not saying we should never let in immigrants at all times and all places. I'm looking at our specific situation today in 2020, and I'm asking myself, what is best for the country as a whole? And given the scale of immigration, given the nature of modern technology and that when you leave, you don't leave for good, given the fact that all previous waves of massive immigration required time to digest, considering that I believe that the melting pot model is good. I reject hard Canadian-style multiculturalism. If you left and you came here, you should become an American. I think we need time to digest this wave of immigration. We can then have this debate 50 years from now again, and I might change my policy because unlike Alex, I'm not a dogmatist. I look at the situation on the grounds and I make a prudential call. And I think that what's best for the country right now is to considerably scale down immigration, to digest the enormous wave of immigrants we've had, and then we can have a different debate a few years from now, or a few decades from now, once we've done so.
All right, so at this point, I think Jasper has a microphone, and we're going to go around and open it up to audience questions. We have one over here.
Thank you. It was a very interesting discussion. So, as a Greek, I have a vested interest in promoting immigration.
Sorry.
I would have a vested interest in supporting the pro-immigration position, but my question would be the following. Even libertarian economists such as Milton Friedman have recognized that you can't have open borders with a welfare state. And also, Milton Friedman has delineated in the past that welfare policies tend to be, despite their original design, which might be ephemeral, they tend to get perpetuated simply because there are strong groups that have an interest in preserving that policy. And so why is, I would like for you to elucidate your position on immigration. Would the gentleman support total open borders that would also imply poorly educated and poorly skilled migrants who would probably take more out of the system than contribute in revenues? Would the gentleman actually support such a model of open borders, or would he just support a model that promotes immigration that's economically beneficial in the sense that immigrants contribute more in taxes than they derive through the welfare state?
So I do support, of course, some restrictions. I mentioned them a few times on security, health restrictions, public safety, and things like that. The welfare state is a problem in the United States, and I admit that. I'd rather get rid of the entire welfare state, including the biggest portion of it, which are the entitlement programs. But some of the little portions about the U.S. welfare state are important to know. Illegal immigrants are ineligible for means-tested welfare benefits in the U.S. under current law. There are some small exceptions, but those are basically at the state level. Legal immigrants are ineligible for the first 5 years, with some very few exceptions to that. Legal immigrants in the United States use less means-tested welfare benefits than the average American, even when not controlling for poverty or anything like that, and immigrants do have lower income. Generally, and they use a lot less when it comes to the entitlement program. So to give you an example, immigrants pay in $14 billion a year more into Medicare Part A, which is the main portion of the Medicare program, the part that's going to go bankrupt in about 15 or 16 years, than they take out of it. By contrast, native-born Americans take out $31 billion a year more than what they put in. Despite what you've been told, they're not actual functioning retirement programs, but transitional gains programs. The American welfare state is designed primarily to help three groups of people: sick, elderly, women. Sick, Medicare and Medicaid; elderly, Social Security and Medicare; and women. Most of the means-tested welfare programs are designed for single mothers. Immigrants, however, are mostly healthy young men. So there was a fundamental disconnect between who the intended beneficiaries of the welfare state are and who the immigrants are as well. Now, when you take a look at the net fiscal impact of immigrants in the United States, for just about every group, they're positive. For high school dropout immigrants who arrive under the age of 25, they pay more in taxes over the course of their life than they take out in terms of benefits to the United States. But if this is your concern, and I do share this concern, right, then I think that you should favor building a wall around the welfare state instead of a wall around the country. U.S. laws mostly do that already. I would love to strengthen them. I would love to make them tougher. But if that's the disagreement, right, let's talk about welfare reform. Let's not talk about locking out people and tinkering with demographics through central planning via immigration.
Dr. Azerrad, did you have a response to Mr. Nowrasteh's answer?
Yeah, and we've had great success in scaling back the welfare state, so I'm sure we're going to be capable of doing that. So by all means, let's continue to have a combination of, I mean, look, we now have something approaching open borders. We've lost all control over our southern border. I mean, it pains me to say this as someone who admires this country so much as a foreigner and aspires to become an American. It's pathetic. What a national disgrace that America, that put a man on the moon and won World War II, is not even capable of controlling its borders. What a joke this has become, that America bestows citizenship on the children of illegal aliens. So if you break our laws, we reward you by giving you citizenship. I mean, the current system we have is a complete joke, and of course they're, on the one hand, gaining access to welfare, but what your models can never, ever factor in is all of the intangibles, the extra congestion, the toll on the environment, the tolls on the schools. Yeah, they may come as single men, but they end up having kids. That doesn't factor in. You can't measure all of these things. So you measure the good things, you measure 4 of the bad things, and then you're just like, lo and behold, it's all wonderful. I mean, if you use basic common sense, it just absolutely doesn't add up. That we could have the welfare state we have with something approaching open borders, and you could defend this with a smile and say, oh, don't worry, we'll wall off the welfare state.
It's kind of amazing. We have stuff that we can't measure, but he knows the answer to all of it. The 1996 welfare reform law substantially cut welfare benefits, especially for immigrants in the United States. So we have cut welfare much more successfully than we've cut illegal immigration over the years. Secondly, to say the U.S. has anything close to open borders is kind of a joke. It's kind of laughable. The number of people who come here annually legally is somewhere around 1 million people a year.
So that's not true. We had almost 2 million a couple of years ago. It was an all-time high.
Well, I'm talking about legal immigration. When it comes to illegal immigration, we have to add some more. But to say that that's anywhere near open borders is ridiculous. That's a joke. Then what policy are you disagreeing with then? We have it now. I mean, we definitely don't have open borders. The green card wait time, there are 5 million people in the backlog right now for green cards waiting. Where's the open borders? Where's the free immigration? I don't see it. Why are people coming illegally then? Where are they? Why are they doing that? If they could come legally, why are they coming illegally across the border and paying tens of thousands of dollars to smugglers?
Well, there are between, I mean, okay, well, let's... No.
I mean, you can go on, it's okay.
Well, I don't want to monopolize the debate, although that's why they brought us here, is to debate.
I know, right? If you want to hear what you have to say.
I mean, I don't understand what you're saying. I mean, we have anywhere between, I mean, heaven knows how many illegal aliens are here. We keep on hearing the Pew number at 11 million. And the amazing thing is it never goes up. I mean, I've been living in America, I don't know how long. It's always 11 million, never goes up. Yale did a study, actually, out of all places, that put the number at, I mean, they don't know, but they've said that the more like between 16 and 29 million, with a mean of 22 million illegals who are here. So I didn't say we have actual open borders. I say the combination of the fact that the southern border is porous, that you can overstay your visa with impunity, with no problem, that we don't have E-Verify, and that we grant citizenship to the children of anyone who's born on our territory, means that we have something much closer to open borders than a sovereign nation with control over its borders. That's all I'm saying.
If there are that many illegal immigrants in the U.S. and their effect on American society is far smaller than anything that we've been talking about here today, including their crime rates. They already have lower crime rates than native-born Americans. If there's 30 million of them, that means they have the lowest crime rate and incarceration rate of like any population in the United States. And they have the fewest children of any population. Does anybody believe that? No, math, hashtag math. Like, that's what a rate is.
All right, gentlemen, I want us to get to another question.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. My question is sort of on the assimilation side. It's been brought up a lot, but in your mind, what does it mean to become an American? What items on the checklist, because they speak English in the United Kingdom and Canada. There are plenty of Catholics in Latin America, and that's certainly the majority of the immigrants who are coming in through our southern border. What does it mean? Is it just liberty and a belief in the rule of law? Or
I presume the question is directed
for both of you.
I mean, mine is, I speak from a conservative point of view. I don't hide my point of view. My assessment is the following. We had a regime change in America in the 20th century. Not that anyone stormed the White House, shot the president, and came in there and then he was killed by his brother-in-law, like happens elsewhere. The fundamental authoritative conceptions of justice, the understanding of Republican self-government was fundamentally transformed. And as a result, we live in a wokeocracy today and not in a republic. And as a result, we are not even assimilating our own native-born children into Americanism. And so this is, like I said, mine is not a diatribe against immigrants that they come here and they don't like America. Is we've lost control of our own country. And therefore, I don't want to compound the problem. I would want to stabilize it, find a way to retake the institutions, reinstill a proper spirit of Americanism amongst the elites, and then we're going to be in a position once again to assimilate the immigrants. But as I see it right now, if you'll allow me a strange use of the word assimilate, we're not even assimilating Americans. Or rather, we're assimilating them into identity politics. We're assimilating them into a form of progressivism that I think that is completely untenable in the medium, to say nothing of the long term, for the country. That's my diagnosis, and it applies as much to Americans as to immigrants.
So I don't believe in cultural central planning any more than I believe in the economic variety. I don't think the government can choose which culture should magically the best or which combination of this. I listen to what David is saying, and what it seems like to me is that his idea of being American is something consistent with these conservative principles that he's laid out today. My conception of what it means to be an American is if you're consistent with American culture as it actually exists, not as it exists in some fantasy land that it never ever has been. When we measure things such as language, speaking the English language, religiosity, civic participation, family size, income, education, the names of your children, immigrants assimilate very well. They're more likely to say America is the best country in the world. I think that's pretty good. I think that's great. I look around and I hear about these problems with assimilation, and I grew up in Los Angeles, by the way. I didn't grow up in some small town where everybody was whiter than me, but I grew up in Southern California, and it's going great. In Southern California, by the way, third generation, the average third generation Hispanic American whose grandparents came doesn't speak Spanish at all. 77% of third generation Hispanics in the United States speak only English. 22%, however, say that they are bilingual. 100% say they all speak English, at least well. And I'm sure a lot of those guys who say they're bilingual don't speak it very well. My father, who was born here, but his parents are from Iran, he claims to be bilingual, and he speaks Farsi like he's 4 years old. Like, that's not bilingual. And I suspect that that's the same. I mean, this is a monolingual labor market. This is a monolingual country. You can't really get ahead without it, and you can't really assimilate without it. We heard a lot about modern technology and how that makes it so that immigrants don't have to assimilate. It works the other way. It means that people overseas have more exposure to American culture, American language, American norms, about everything than they've ever had before. And we see that today. The modern immigrant from Guadalajara today is more American than the average Irish immigrant who came here in 1850. They are far more familiar with American culture than people from the past.
Right, we're going to move on to another question.
The two arguments that you identified, one, the history of immigration policy, and then the benefits of immigration policy. I'd like to focus on the former. Mm-hmm. And this is not ideological, this is not confrontational, heaven forbid. At the time of the creation of the Constitution, what were the immigration policies of other Western nations, and how did it differ based on maybe the density of population, or what made it differ if it differed? And what I'm thinking of is the 13th century, I think, 12th, 13th century in Eastern Europe, depopulated by the Mongols and the plague. Germans were brought in to the Czech Republic area, brought into Romania, persisted as a German population for centuries, and ultimately, come the 30s, it was maybe an issue.
So historically, a lot of other countries in the Western world, and I'm only familiar with Western Europe primarily at this time, not with other countries at that time. The country with the greatest immigration restrictions at the time was Spain in Europe. They really didn't allow many people in at all. The United Kingdom, anybody could live there and work there if they wanted to, but becoming a citizen was really where the big distinction was in terms of the policies. So when I read that portion from the Declaration of Independence about naturalization, like King George limiting naturalization, that's because under English common law at the time, you had to be a citizen in order to own real property. And farming was the big occupation, of course, at the time. So they created a special citizenship status called denization. If you ever seen the word denizen talking about citizenship, this is where it comes from. It's sort of this middle ground, kind of like a green card is today, where you get basically most of the rights and responsibilities of a place where you can live there, you can work there, have no other incumbents, no other barriers, but you're stopped short of being a citizen. So that's basically what it was. So the U.S., when they wrote the Constitution, did not include anything about restricting immigration in the document at all. They did, however, have a section in there about naturalization. And they said that the Congress can determine who becomes a citizen and things like that. So that was the real dividing line, not so much about population flows, but about citizenship.
I don't know why you keep on repeating this when it's just not true, that there is no power to control immigration in the Constitution. And then to have the temerity to appeal to the Declaration of Independence and invoke the classical liberal tradition to suggest that someone like John Locke thought that, yeah, when you form a social compact, you in effect do not have the right to exclude people from that compact. So we Americans set up a civil society, but somehow in doing so, we don't have the right to exclude anyone. I mean, you may get this from Murray Rothbard. I mean, that's an acceptable authority to appeal to justify this. Do not invoke the founders or John Locke or classical liberalism or any serious political thinker to defend open borders, because you won't find one.
So John Locke only wrote one thing about immigration. He wrote an essay called For a General Naturalization in 1693. It was recently discovered, it's not one of his older ones, where he basically wrote that naturalization and allowing people to come to your country is the shortest and easiest way to increase the number of people, that all wise governments should encourage it. The United Kingdom should continue to encourage it. It's in the benefits of all the citizens of this country. And he specifically criticized Spain, said it was a poor and backwards country, partially because they didn't allow any foreigners into their country. So to actually appeal to the writings of the man that you cited, sure, he doesn't go toward a total vast open borders position, but it's far closer to that than anything you've said. So, furthermore, in the Constitution, you cited the part that says law of nations. That is not the justification used by any court in the United States for immigration laws. They invented it out of whole cloth. The part that you talk about, the law of nations, is basically punishing piracy on the high seas. That is what that is for. The portion of the Constitution that was invented out of whole cloth by courts in the late 1880s said that because the United States is a sovereign country, immigration restrictions are part of inherent power of a sovereign government. Therefore, they have the power to do whatever they want. Congress has plenary power. Sure, all the other powers that we think are essential to a state were enumerated in the Constitution, not immigration. But we just let courts invent powers for Congress whenever we want, when it suits us.
So because the Supreme Court got it wrong, I mean, that never happened. So surely it can't be there if the Supreme Court didn't see it. And then going back to Locke, by all means, let's follow his specific advice on what should be done 300 years ago in a particular case, and ignore something he wrote called the Second Treatise of Government, which lays down the basic principles of natural right and social contract theory, which makes obviously clear that you have a right to exclude people from your social contract.
From citizenship, yes, absolutely.
From entering too, you control the sovereign territory.
Hugo Grotius, Francisco de Vitoria, lots of other writers at the same time in the natural law tradition vehemently disagree with that. In fact, some of them said that if a country actually blocks asylum seekers, it is the legitimate right of those asylum seekers to use violence to enter. Now, I don't go that far. That's a little too natural rightsy for my taste. But you're frankly misconstruing and misrepresenting the natural rights tradition, which is a lot more nuanced and has a lot more support, for my opinion, than you're willing to admit.
And you're single-handedly destroying it by implying that it mandates open borders, which is incompatible with the idea of having a country, not as a matter of policy at a particular time, but as a fundamental principle of right.
All right, we're going to move on to another question. I think we have one here and one in the back corner. Go here.
I told you it wasn't going to be boring.
It's always fun.
Okay, let's see if I can remember.
So right now you guys have managed to go back and forth on a lot of the history and a lot of the policy over the years. And one of the things I wanted to try to bring up was the way things are different today as they were in the past. Like, I was wondering about the impact of the demographic shift of the immigrants. Like, before the major changes in immigration, and even when Alex was talking about how the U.S. had a more open immigration policy, the U.S. was mostly taking in people from Western Europe. And then now modern immigration has changed to favor Latin America and basically Asia.
Yeah, so we think of race or ethnicity and stuff in modern terms when we look back at the past, and it's not really appropriate in a lot of ways. For instance, what it meant to be, you know, say like white in the year 1750 or 1800 is a pretty different definition than what it is today. For instance, when the U.S. government closed the borders in the 1920s, they specifically used it to target Eastern and Southern European immigrants who were coming in large numbers at the time. And there are a lot of really like absurd, if you want to go back to the congressional transcript, arguments about this. So a lot of people are saying we can't have these immigrants in, they're not white, blah, blah, blah. And people are like, well, what race are they? And they would make up these stupid terms. They'd be like, oh, they're part of the Mediterranean race. You see, the real white race are the Nordics from Northern Europe. Benjamin Franklin actually has a great, really silly line about this where he talks about how German immigration is bad, and he mentions the Germans as being swarthy. I don't know, I think of a lot of things when I think of Germany, but swarthy is not one of the words I would say about this. But one of the concerns about demographic change, about what you're talking about, has been something that has fueled the immigration debate for a very long time. In the 1850s and 60s, people were concerned about the Irish. They thought the Irish didn't count as true white people for a lot of very different ways. I know, like, it's silly, right? But this stuff is all like absurd. People were complaining about Eastern Europeans, Jews, Poles, Russians, others, as being in the same category. Southern Italians, like, I wouldn't count, neither of us would count as white under the common social definitions of the term in the late 19th and early 20th century. But lo and behold, the descendants of these people who have melted in, who have bred in, they're their kids, I mean, I don't know what we would be considered except, you know, but white. So these things are changing dramatically. And one of the things we see, especially with Hispanic immigration to the United States, is that there's this sort of ethnic attrition that is going on. By generation, Hispanic Americans are just becoming, like, self-identifying not as Hispanic over time, but more and more so as part of like big racial groups like white and black and everything like that. So everybody talks about how the United States is on track to become a majority-minority nation. Well, not if the trends of Hispanic self-identification in the census actually continue.
Dr. Azerrad, it looks like you have a rebuttal pending.
No, I don't have a rebuttal. I would say, you know, he went to race right away. I think there's another way to approach the question, which would be to bring up the question of culture. Are all national cultures equally assimilatable? Regrettably, we can't have conversations about these things because we live in the age of cancellation. And so I'm not going to go there because I don't want to have my life destroyed because I said something that potentially offended someone. But if we lived in a reasonable age, I think one conversation we could have is which countries or parts of the world have cultures, not races, that are more aligned with ours and make them more likely to be assimilated. For what it's worth today, when I look at the world today, it's not like I look at Europe and I think, wow, please send me more people who are not entrepreneurial, dependent on a welfare state, you know, and nowhere near as dynamic as Americans. I don't want America to become more like Sweden. Bernie Sanders does, I don't. You know, I'm not exactly, when I look at the world today, seeing a country that strikes me as being, yes, these are nascent Americans. So but I think it would be, in a different time, perfectly legitimate to bring up the question of culture, not of race. But regrettably, we can't talk about this in America today.
Mr. Nowrasteh, before we move on to the last question, I just had one question of my own. Why do you think that, at least in 2016, President Trump's sort of hawkish immigration platform resonated so much with so many Americans? Was this a product of them simply being like misled, or do you think there's some legitimacy to a lot of the feelings that were being expressed about a country that's changing too quickly and then perhaps has a culture that looks very different than it did 30 years ago, at least in some part because of millions of new immigrants coming in?
So I'm not going to say anything new about Trump that hasn't already been said in multiple places and much better way than what I'm going to say it. But to say that he won entirely because of immigration, I think is just not true. There were lots of other people in the Republican primary who said about the same thing early on. From Scott Walker said about the same thing. Rick Santorum, Mike Huckabee said the same stuff about how they wanted to restrict legal immigration and enforce immigration laws, and they got nowhere. Trump said stuff that was very similar and got somewhere. So doesn't necessarily tell me very much about it. In terms of where the country is, in terms of polls on this topic that have been going back to the 1960s, Americans are right now more supportive of expanding legal immigration than at any time since they started taking those polls in the mid-60s. According to Gallup, about 30% of Americans want to increase immigration to the U.S., about 30% want to cut it, and the rest want to keep it about the same. In the mid-1990s, about 70% of people wanted to cut legal immigration. So in a way, I think what we're seeing is just public opinion is gradually moving in that direction of going back to the founding American ideas of being at least a little bit more open to immigration. But I don't think it's fair to say that the 2016 election was about any one thing. I think it was about a lot of things. And frankly, when you take a look at the popular vote totals, when you take a look at the opinions that people at least have across the United States, it's not clear that it's a mandate for any kind of particular policy.
I think we had another question in the back.
First of all, does this work? Do you? Oh, for the camera. Okay. Both of you made amazing arguments, real powerhouses. Very, very impressive. This question is for Alex. I was skeptical of your data. The reason I'm skeptical of your data is I don't know who put this data together. My question is, how do you control for ideological bias in the collection of this data about assimilation and so on and so forth, and the economic data as well? How do we know that the people who are compiling this data weren't ideologically driven?
Well, this data is based on, for instance, census data that poll millions of people every year combined over decades and decades. I don't know if there's a specific ideological bias that prompts them to say, exaggerate the incomes and educations of immigrants or their children. To go it that way. But if you want to take a look at some studies on your own, or these massive studies so you can determine for yourself, Jake Vigdor, who is an economist at the University of Washington, who, by the way, wrote one of the major pieces recently saying, yes, the minimum wage does destroy jobs in the United States and does put people out of work. He's a straight-up empiricist. I've been trying to find out his ideology for a while, but he doesn't tell me. He used to write papers about how immigrants are not assimilating, then he changed his mind, actually. He used to publish them at the Manhattan Institute, and he changed his mind. He published this paper with Oxford University Press in a book I can send you. There's a National Academy of Sciences literature review that's about 600 pages. Cites somewhere around like 2,000 different peer-reviewed academic studies that take a look about 18 different factors of assimilation, from all the ones I mentioned and additional ones like health, for instance, so you can take a look at that. All I'm saying is if we can find out, and if I can find out that assimilation is not going well, if I can find out that these studies are bad, if they don't work, then please, let's figure that out. Let's publish it so I can win a whole boatload of academic prizes for overturning what is the consensus in a lot of the academic literature. I'd love to overturn that. That would make my career. I have mouths to feed, man. I have children, I have a wife, I have a mortgage. Let's figure that out, and let's do it, and let's publish it. But I mean, and I have lots of other studies that I can send you if you want to talk afterwards in literature surveys. But the evidence is pretty good, pretty consistent. And the same people who find this stuff in the United States, they take a look at assimilation in other countries, and they say, yeah, it's not going so well over there. Not going as well as it is in the United States.
All right, well, we have about 5 minutes remaining, which means that has to be our last question, unfortunately, and we're going to leave about 2 minutes for each of our guests, starting with Dr. Azerrad to provide a closing recap of their statements today, and then after that, we will have to conclude the event.
There's a fundamental difference. Well, there are many differences between myself and Alex, but one big one is that there are no set of circumstances under which Alex would deviate from his position. You could have him debate this issue in any country at any time. He is always going to argue for open borders because he believes that justice demands it. I, on the other hand, am making an argument tailored to America today. Now, I'm open to the possibility that I'm wrong, but I don't begin by saying we must have less immigration. I begin by saying I want to look at the particular country at a particular moment. Where are the immigrants coming from? In what number? In what proportion? What is the state of the country? And then decide what is the right immigration policy for the country at that time. And then you would change it once the circumstances change. And my argument is that today, in 2020, after the wave of 60 million immigrants who've come since the 65 Act, after being at the share of the population that is foreign-born, that is the highest in a century, given the divisions we have in the country today, we should lower the number of immigrants so that we can digest and assimilate this wave. And I should add, we should also reform our immigration system more fundamentally. I mentioned this a couple of times in passing. Let me say it in closing, that it is ludicrous that we would bestow citizenship upon the children of illegal aliens. That is not based on a proper reading of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was passed to guarantee that former slaves would have citizenship, not that anyone who so happens to come to America in violation of our laws would be rewarded by giving their children citizenship. Thank you.
So I'll tell you at a point where I do disagree, where I would disagree with my position. That is the reason why the United States is a rich society is not because of magic blood or magic culture or magic location or anything like this, but it's because we have better institutions. We have free markets, we have private property, we have institutions that incentivize productive and voluntary mutually beneficial behavior. Immigrants, on the other hand, come from countries with worse institutions. They come from countries where they don't value free markets and individual liberty nearly as much as they do in the United States. So if immigrants, by virtue of coming here, their descendants don't change their opinions, they don't change their opinions, and they actually change public policy in a direction so that the economic losses from them being here by worsening our institutions are greater than the gains from them being here, then I would favor immigration restrictions. In fact, I recently submitted a book to Cambridge University Press actually analyzing this topic because I've co-authored or authored about 80% of the peer-reviewed papers on this topic. And I've done that because it is the best potential counter-argument to my position, and it is one that would change my mind to being in favor of immigration restrictions. What do we find in this peer-reviewed evidence? What do we find? Immigrants either have no effect on native institutions where they settle, or they tend to improve them. We took a look at a paper published in Public Choice where immigrants settle around the world between 1990 and 2011, and we found that places that had waves of immigrants in the past, relatively recent past, had greater improvements in economic freedom than places that didn't have them. So it turns out there might actually be a positive economic freedom dividend to allowing more people to come to the United States freely. So that's where I would cut that off and where I would disagree with myself if the evidence says it. And this is what I think is the biggest difference between us. I am looking at evidence. I want to know what facts are. I want to know not just my personal opinion or what I see or if I'm upset with some liberal somewhere who says things that are crazy and weird. No, it's things that I take a look on the ground in a country of 330 million people who I cannot possibly have an opinion about just by meeting people in my ordinary life. I have to take a look at facts. I have to use statistics. I have to use models. That is the scientific method for analyzing this. The evidence is overwhelming. Do you think the United States is a small, failing country where immigrants don't assimilate? Or do you take a look at the actual evidence and find, hey, actually it's working out pretty well? When it comes, yeah, so that's, I'm going to cut it off right there. But evidence, evidence, evidence. Let's take a look at the facts. Talking about our feelings, talking about this, that, or the other thing, bold statements about how immigrants aren't assimilating and the elites are responsible for ruining public school or whatever, as if public school is the reason why anybody ever learned English in the United States or learned to love this country. Immigrants and Americans love America because it is lovable, not because some nosy elitist or some public school teacher or some other person in the news told you to love it.
Well, I know I speak for the room when I say that this was an incredibly fascinating debate this afternoon. Vigorous exchange, which we always appreciate. If everyone would please join me in thanking David Azerrad and Alex Nowrasteh.
You too.